Sir William Wallace, patriot, the national hero of Scotland. He had fought valiantly for the freedom of his country, but he now found himself on trial for his life. The charge, high treason.
You stand here accused of the most heinous crime of treason against the realm of His Most Gracious Majesty King Edward. How do you plead? How do you plead, man? Speak. Speak!
I never swore fealty to Edward. You bring me here for an act of judicial murder!
You're silence! Let the man
speak! Fired with a spirit of independence, knowing what he did not as bondsman in service to some feudal lord, but as freeman, marching and fighting and dying for their own sakes, their homes, our nation! The men who follow William Wallace choose to do so! Oh, Edward's men fight well, but they take up arms upon instruction to fight for a prize most craved by their master! We are not soldiers! Yet we fight for a prize far greater than any crown or pretty bauble that Edward might dream of. We fight for freedom! I never swore freedom! I never swore freedom! I want to let God ever!
Politicians and polemicists have argued that Wallace's story and the story of Scotland's struggle for independence are one and the same. If so, then both tales can be said to commence on a wind-swept cliff path some 10 years before William Wallace emerges as a principal player in the history of Scotland. When Alexander our king was dead, that Scotland laid in loch and lea, away with sons of ale and breed, of wine and wax, of gaming and glee. On the night of the 19th of March 1286, Alexander III, the last of Scotland's Celtic kings, rode from Edinburgh to join his wife at Kinghorn, Fife. His horse stumbling, the great man was thrown, falling to his death over the steep cliff face. His body was found on the rocks the following morning. Scotland had prospered during Alexander's mostly peaceful reign. His line, that of Malcolm Canmore and St. Margaret, was less fortunate. His only surviving heir, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, 3 years old at the time of her succession, died without ever setting foot on Scottish soil. With the passing of the House of Canmore, it was not long before the Scots nobles began squabbling over the crown. All in all, there were 13 competitors for the Scots throne. Fearing civil war, the Guardians of Scotland invited Edward I of England to preside over an inquiry as to which of the Scots nobles had the strongest claim. He chose John Balliol, son-in-law to Edward de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, one of his most trusted generals. In return for his support, the English king demanded allegiance and custody of the most important Scottish castles. Many such concessions were granted. Enthroned at Scone on St Andrew's Day, 1292, Balliol soon found his southern neighbours' continual demands and interventions intolerable. When the English king demanded the service of Scots troops to help wage war in France, the community of the realm compelled Balliol to abrogate his allegiance to Edward, advocating, in turn, a renewal of the Auld Alliance with France. Edward's response was swift and severe. He commanded that Surrey lead an army of invasion against his royal son-in-law. At that time, Scotland had two armies, a feudal force of landowners, obliged to provide a knight and a handful of followers for any conflict, and the army proper, consisting of any adult males with the strength to take up arms. Neither had taken the field since Alexander's victory at the Battle of Largs, some 30 years past. The English, on the other hand, had just successfully conquered Wales. It was to prove a great mismatch. The feudal army was routed at Dunbar, and John Balliol was forced to flee. In July 1296, he surrendered to Edward's forces at Stracathro, and stripped of his royal insignia, was imprisoned within the Tower of London. Imposing direct rule and taxation, Edward now claimed outright overlordship over Scotland, demanding that each Scots noble and landowner swear an oath of allegiance to the English crown. Each in turn was required to add his name to a declaration acknowledging his right to rule, a document guaranteeing obedience to Edward and to Surrey, the newly proclaimed Governor of Scotland. It was to become known to later generations by the scornful title, the Ragman's Roll. Those that refused to sign found their lands, titles, and even their lives forfeit. One such man was William Wallace. Born in 1270, the second son of Sir Malcolm Wallace of Elderslie, Renfrewshire, William did not emerge from obscurity until the age of 27. For many of the details of his early life, we are dependent on the work of Henry, or Blind Harry, the minstrel. Although Harry wrote his great ballad nearly 2 centuries after the death of Wallace, he claimed as his authority a contemporary Latin work by John Blair. Sadly, this account has not survived the passing of ages. Blind Harry, therefore, is the best source we have concerning the life of William Wallace. Blind Harry's epic poem, The Wallace, associates the young William's early years with Dundee and Ayrshire. He is said to have trained for the priesthood in Dundee, but as the poem is not a primary source, we do need to treat it with some caution. Some facts are more certain. In May 1297, leading a small band of men, Wallace burned Lanark and killed the English sheriff, Hazelrig. According to legend, he did so either to avenge the death of his wife or the wife of one of his comrades. Now with the price on his head, Wallace retreated to the comparative safety of the Ettrick Forest. There, to plan a guerrilla campaign against Surrey's officers and those loyal to Sir Hugo de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland. News of his revolt spread quickly.
From all over the land we came to him, fired with the spirit to independence, sure in the knowledge that what we did not as bondsmen in service to some feudal maester, but as free men, marching and fighting and dying for ourselves, our families, our nation. I followed the Wallace, aye, but no as a vassal. I followed proud William because I chose to do so. We must have made a pretty sight. A ragbag army o' half-starved farmers, tanners, hammermen and the like. Hardly a soldier among us. Governor Surrey's men laughed when we first took arms against them. How could so feeble a force pose any threat to the might o' the overlord? They didn't laugh long. Edward Longshank's men were good soldiers, aye, but they fought only because they were told to fight. We fought for a prize far greater than any crown or pretty bauble the English tyrant might dream of. We fought for our freedom.
Cheered by his example, more and more ordinary men put down the tools of their trades and joined the resistance. This was conflict through choice rather than feudal obligation, fought by a people's army. As Wallace fought in the south, so did Andrew de Murray in the north. Like Wallace, Murray had refused to sign the ragman's roll and suffered the consequences of the rebellion. Their victories were few and bought with their dearest blood. But against all expectations, the rebels endured, a thorn in the side of the English king. Surrey determined to put an end to the rebels once and for all. In August 1297, the English army set out from Berwick, led by Sir Richard Lundy, Sir Hugo de Cressingham, and, at their head, Governor Surrey himself. 10,000 foot soldiers, 500 cavalry. Surrey was sure that he could easily brush aside any resistance he might chance upon. On the 10th of September, the English army set up camp on the south bank of the River Forth. The rebels, outnumbered 5-1, readied themselves atop Stirling's Abbey Craig, under the joint command of Wallace and de Murray. This posed something of a problem. To the west of Stirling, the Forth was bounded by peat bogs, and to the east, the waters flowed too wide and too fast to be crossed without boats. There was, of course, a ford some miles downstream, but de Cressingham, reluctant to waste further time and the king's coin, and confident of success, insisted that the English force would cross via the Stirling Bridge, a rickety wooden structure, so narrow that only 2 horsemen could cross abreast of one another. A fatal error.
As dawn broke the next morning, we took our positions on the rock, watching as the English cavalry began their slow march across the narrow walkway. Suddenly they stopped dead in their tracks, turned slowly about, and set off back the way they came. The Earl of Surrey, it seems, had overslept, and sent word that the battle was no to start without him. In time they resumed their crossing, with de Cressingham now riding at their head. We watched and waited as the first horsemen began to alight on the north bank. Many of us pleaded with our leaders to give the order to advance, to let us fall upon the enemy before we were outnumbered. Wallace stood his ground. Be patient, he said, or all may be lost. More came, spreading out below us, their armour glinting in the sunlight. Only when the enemy was split in two by the river was the command given to attack. And only then did we see why proud William had urged us to bide our time. For their arms in great numbers, the English were trapped. We us bearing down on them from above, and the bog pinning them in on either side. They had nowhere to go but back the way they came, across the bridge. Many turned on their heels, driving headlong into the still advancing forces of Lundy and Surrey. More and more piled onto the wooden walkway, the bridge groaning under their great weight. Suddenly, its supports gave way, plunging its burden into the waters of the Forth.
Those English knights who had remained upon the north bank were forced into the bog or slaughtered where they stood. Surrey was forced to watch from the other side. It is said that De Cressingham, whose taxes had stripped the shirts from the backs of many a poor Scot, was one of the first to fall. Wallace, with ironic savagery, had the skin flayed from his body and had it decorate the baldric of his sword. English losses were enormous, their host retreating southwards. Scottish losses were few, although de Murray was fatally wounded, dying some 2 months after the battle. Now hailed as the people's champion, Wallace went on to reclaim Berwick and raid the territories of Northumberland. In March of 1298, he was made guardian of the realm in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. He attempted to muster military and financial support from the continent, particularly from Rome and the German cities of the Hanseatic League, asking their assistance in the liberation of Scotland. But none came, and time was running out for Wallace. Edward made plans to reoccupy his troublesome northern lands and establish himself, once and for all, as the Hammer of the Scots. In the spring of 1298, Edward himself led his army northwards to meet with Wallace's host at Falkirk on the 11th of July. The small cavalry force available to him, under the command of Sir John Comyn, proved ineffective, and the Scots spearsmen were forced to bear the brunt of the conflict. Their packed ranks made an easy target for the English longbow, and the Scots army dispersed under a hail of arrows as fierce as that which would later be loosed at Agincourt. Defeated, his country again overrun by Edward's forces, Wallace resigned his position as guardian and, early in 1299, fled for France. By doing so, he hoped to enlist support for his cause in Scotland, but it was to no avail. With Wallace gone, in the years which followed, more and more of the Scots nobles seemed prepared to accept the authority of the English overlord. Former rebels, such as John Comyn, negotiated good terms with England and served on Edward's Scottish Council, appointed to manage the land, not the kingdom. So Wallace's decision to return to his homeland in 1303 was a risky venture from the start. For many months he lived the life of a fugitive, attempting to rekindle support for the rebellion, until, in 1305, he was finally betrayed and captured by Sir John de Menteith, Sheriff of Dumbarton at Rob Royston. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this was the work of Robert the Bruce. Menteith, a Scot, had originally opposed Edward, but after imprisonment in 1296 threw in his lot with the invader and was appointed Keeper of Dumbarton Castle and Earl of Lennox. Dispatched as a prisoner to London, Sir William Wallace was detained at Westminster Hall, there to be tried on a charge of high treason.
William Wallace of Elderslie, Scotland. You stand here accused of the most heinous crime of treason against the realm of His Most Gracious Majesty King Edward. How do you plead? How do you plead, man? Speak. Speak!
I never swore fealty to Edward. You bring me here for an act of judicial murder! From all over the land they came to me, fired with a spirit of independence, knowing what they did not as bondsmen in service to some feudal lord, but as freemen, marching and fighting and dying for their own sakes, their homes, families, our nation! The men who follow William Wallace choose to do so! Oh, Edward's men fight well. They take up arms upon instruction to fight for a prize most craved by their master! We are not soldiers! Yet we fight for a prize far greater than any crown or pretty bauble that Edward might dream of. We fight for freedom! I never swore freedom! I never swore freedom! I never swore freedom! Anyone unless God ever!
Alas, Scotland, to whom shall thou complain? Alas, for pain, what shall thee now restrain? Alas, thy help is fastly brocht to ground. Thy best chieftain in braith bands is bound.
Throughout the proceedings, he refused to acknowledge the authority of the court or of the English law, or the right of the English to rule in Scotland. How then could he, a patriot, be guilty of treasonous acts against an invader? Ye cry me traitor. On what account, sirrah? I am nothing more or less than an honest Scot. What is my crime? That I will not submit myself to the domination of Edward Longshanks, of Edward's ministers, of Edward's law? Can it be accounted treason for an honest man to take up arms against an invader, one who would strive to deprive him of his land and his liberty, those things, above all others, which no honest man will lose but with his life?
Alas, thou hast now lost thy guide of licht. Alas, wha shall defend thee in thy recht? Thy gracious guide, thy greatest governor. Alas, our near is coming his fatal hour.
On the 23rd of August, 1305, William Wallace of Elderslie was publicly hanged, drawn and quartered. His limbs sent for display to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth and Stirling as an example to other presumptuous rebels.
Wha shall thee defend? Wha shall thee now make free? Alas, in war, wha shall thy helper be?
And an example was served, though not, ironically enough, in the way intended by Edward Longshanks. Although Wallace has been superseded in the eyes of posterity by the more successful Robert Bruce, grandson of the competitor of the same name, there seems no doubt that he was an inspiration to the latter, nor that his judicial murder provided the cause of Scottish independence with the heroic martyr it so needed to galvanise popular support. His spirit endured in the sonorous wording of the Declaration of Arbroath, sealed by the Scots nobility nearly 15 years after Wallace's execution.
As long as there shall but 100 of us remain alive, we will never consent to subject ourselves to the domination of the English. For it is not glory, it is not riches, neither is it honour, but it is liberty alone that we fight and contend for, which no honest man will lose, but with his life.
It is a peculiar irony that one of the principal signatories to this document should be Sir John de Menteith, Earl of Lennox, the man to deliver Wallace into the hands of his executioners.
Of Scotland is empty, Bruce. There are many claimants.
Mine is the strongest.
Patience, Bruce. I have no desire for the throne. See, the Stone of Destiny. Scotland's destiny. In your hands.
Yours, Wallace.
Scots were hae wi Wallace bled. Scots when Bruce has often led. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour. See the front o' battle hour. See approach proud Edward's power. Chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave? walk and fill a coward's grave. Was he base as be a slave, let him turn and flee. War for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword will strongly draw. Freemen stand or freemen fall, let him on wi' me. By oppression's woes and pains, by your sons in servile chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but they shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do our deed. Scots were hay wi' Wallace bled, Scots were bruised as often led. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front o' battle hour, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery.
The thing about taking a role like this is that it carries quite a heavy responsibility. And for an actor, it's not just another job, particularly if you have a feel for this sort of thing, which I do. Empathy, if you will. I don't see myself as a freedom fighter by any means. But when it's your national hero, it's quite easy to become emotionally involved in a piece like this. You have to give it gravitas. It's not just another footery wee acting job. You have to bring as much integrity to a piece as this. I've spent a long time working on this, and I want it to work, not just for myself, that wherever this programme goes, hopefully all over the world, that we'll have done justice to the memory of William Wallace.
I bought this shield, the Bruce shield from the film, The Bruce, and it's been a great experience playing part in the film as an extra. I've done a walk with the 1745 Jacobites, which was all for charity as well, but Wallace, he's the man for me, the hero of Scotland.
I beat you, Edward. It was victory. I drove your forces back to where they came from. I was a hero to my people. The flowing currents of the River Forth gradually washed away the blood and the stench of your countrymen. But I had made my mark. I was appointed guardian of Scotland, and my power increased. It grew as the unquenchable desire amongst my people grew. The desire to be free, the desire to be free. To sweep aside your iron, unjust rule, to free Scotland from tyranny, and it will continue to grow. That was, it's from a piece called Wallace's Heel. It's just a short extract from a fairly lengthy monologue based around, fictitiously obviously, about Wallace's time in prison. It's been played in a few places at Ayr, Dundee, at Street Theatre, really. I find that does reach an awful lot of people from all over the world. And it's a piece which a lot of people can relate to. I mean, people from all over the world can relate to Wallace as the man that he was. You know, everybody has it. When the piece is performed, you do get some fairly emotional responses from some people. Hasn't been unknown for some to actually, you know, have the tear in the eye sort of thing. It's a very, very good piece to play. It's quite emotional, as I said. It's powerful. It's, you know, very, very, you really get into it once it really gets started. It's the thing about Wallace himself. You know, Wallace, the man. It's all he was. He was a man. He wasn't going out to try and be, you know, this huge king. He wasn't looking for personal power. It was more, he was looking for Scotland. He was wanting Scotland to be free. He was wanting himself to be free. I think a lot of people can, you know, equate with that, especially nowadays. There's so much of, you know, so many power struggles going on. People can look at this piece and look at what's going on. They can really identify with it, I think. I mean, people all over the world have their own heroes. It's the same in every society. There is always somebody. In England, you know, it's Robin Hood is this big, you know, not so much a working class hero, but he's the person's hero, the ordinary man in the street hero. In Scotland, there are a few people who are looked upon like that. Robert the Bruce is looked upon like that. Robert Burns is looked upon like that. Myself, at the end of the day, there is only really one big man in Scotland. That, for me, it has to be William Wallace.
Well, the Wallace story is one where there's not a great deal of hard information on William Wallace. Most of the information that we do know about him comes from Blind Harry's history, which was written in the 15th century. And it was written at a time when the popular culture was moving against the nobles and in favour of the peasants, and the idea that Wallace had led a peasant revolt. Not strictly true, of course. Blind Harry told us that Wallace was a fearless youth with a fair face, light brown hair, a bold eye and a strong arm, and of course that's entirely subjective, whether that has anything to do with the way Wallace may have looked. He certainly quotes Wallace as saying, "England has done as great harms to us, we may not pass and lightly leave it thus." In other words, the Blind Harry's Wallace was very much a selfless patriot, and of course it was a time, a remote time, when patriotism was something that was not generally ascribed to anybody except great nobles and kings. So it was a kind of idea of a common person's, a peasant's leader, and a national patriot that Wallace has portrayed. And of course this now for us, in a time when patriotism means so much else and such a modern confusion of loyalties, that this is a great mystique and something we can look back on and think that, yes, Wallace was a patriot in a time before patriotism almost. William Wallace was first heard of in the early summer of 1297 when he was involved in an incident which resulted in the slaying of an English soldier, and then went on to kill the Sheriff of Lanark. This is an incident that's confused with other incidents of very similar nature. He was reputed to have studied at the seminary in Dundee and to have been involved in a fracas with the son of the English overlord Selby, and to have slain him in an almost exactly identical type situation. Then, of course, there's the fishing trip near Ayr, where he was involved in a dispute with English soldiers. Again, an insult was registered. A fight resulted in the death of an English soldier. So 3 very similar incidents that all seem to have happened in the same summer of 1297. In 1298, a year later, there was the Battle of Falkirk, where Wallace had to go into hiding. And that was the end of his brief time on the national stage, just over a year. Then nothing more is heard of him until 1305, when he was executed at Tyburn. So basically, he's a hero who had a very brief time on the national stage, at a time when there was also other heroes such as Andrew de Murray and even young Robert the Bruce himself. Unlike them, he had perhaps the virtue of dying early and dying in such a horrible manner. Andrew de Murray, of course, died shortly after the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Otherwise, he might have acquired the national status that Wallace has. And Robert the Bruce, of course, was seen to be more fighting for his own crown and dynastic ambitions, and so was perhaps more sullied as a national hero. Most of the information on William Wallace does come from Blind Harry's poem, epic poem, The Wallace, which was written in the 15th century. Now this was clearly an attempt to cast Wallace as a secular saint. It's a martyr, as a popular peasants' leader who became a martyr. Now this is, he in fact described Wallace as a fearless youth with a fair face, bright brown hair, bold eye and a strong arm. And now whether that bears any relation at all to the real Wallace is very difficult to tell. But it shows you the lack of information, genuine information that exists on Wallace, and therefore that in itself creates a mystique from which he can emerge clearly as a stereotyped national liberator figure. Of course, in Wales, just a few years before Wallace, there had been a popular leader there, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. The Wallace story, of course, also being brief, has the merit of being almost like a fable. It has everything in it. It has the selfless patriotism of Wallace himself, who was fighting for no very clear personal ambitions of his own, purely out of national pride and desire to reinstall Scotland as an independent nation from Edward I. He also has the tragedy of having been betrayed by one of his own kind, Sir John Menteith, when the loaf on the table was turned round the other way, was turned upside down to indicate that the servant had successfully managed to steal Wallace's sword as he lay asleep in a cave nearby. And then there's the bloodthirsty end as a traitor, which is so it provoked future waves of nationalist resentment, the fact that he could be described as a traitor when he had never taken homage in any sort to Edward I, unlike King John Balliol and Robert the Bruce, and many of the nobles who subsequently led the second phase of the War of Independence, who in fact did pay homage to Edward I. So he has a clear, unsullied image as a national patriot and as someone who was striving to free his country without any personal thoughts of reward or whatever for himself.
In my own way, it's taking part in this programme produces the sense that, you feel as if you're there and you're fighting for the freedom all over again.
Rob Roy has long been a figure of romance and legend. To some, he has even become a figure of fun. In March 1818, the musical Roy MacGregor opens at the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden.
MacGregor! Husband! Wife! How did you escape their clutches, Rob? Passing through the ford of Avondale, Ewan of Brigland cut the belt that bound us, and I ducked and I dived into the river, where not one trooper in 1,000 would have dared follow me. But how came you within their grasp, Rob? By him who has placed a brand where an olive branch should be, rashly as Balderstone. Wrestlers Baldestone! With my trusty blade, with my trusty, and his neck met, I can assure you, they were well acquainted. Oh, but here, drink, drink and berry. Give him a chance. Well, you must try, man, I can do better. What's the one of my shut up, you! That's them! You can't work with these constant interruptions! Aye! Drink and dance and sing with glee, joy can never make us weary. Our Rob is my soldier free, and Rob Roy has his dearie. Oh, you're some man, Rob Roy! So are you!
Later still, one of the earliest feature films added to the growing legend. But beneath all of the tartan and heather imagery, there lived a real man. This is his story. He was born at Glengyle by Loch Catrin in the Trossachs in the 1670s. His mother, Margaret, was a Campbell, his father, Donald, a MacGregor, a lesser chieftain of the clan Gregor, who had been commissioned as an officer in the army of Stuart King Charles II. Margaret called her son Rab Rua, which found its way into English as Rob Roy. His education was the traditional one of a Scottish child at a school provided by the parish. The scriptures, arithmetic and prayers, all in what was considered to be a foreign language, English, for the native Gaelic was forbidden as a language of learning. His informal education came from his clan elders. Politics, the high affairs of state, filtered through the prison of the MacGregors' history, their friends, their foes, whose acts of treachery became acts of Parliament, intended to wipe out the MacGregors. The clan motto is Regal Modgame, royal is our race, defining a clan anointed by mystical links with ancient kings of Scotland, and the sanctity of honour, where a man's word was his bond, where there was no place for the dissembling or the evasive, where a man lived and worked among his people, shunning the false god of financial ambition. His informal education included master classes in swordplay and the arts of battle and war from his elders, alongside the cultivation of the quick eye, the sure foot, the deft touch. Rob Roy became famous for his striking red hair and long, powerful arms, which could elegantly cut a broadsword through the soft Trossachs air. Such a repertoire of skills were needed amongst the MacGregor clan more than most. Unique amongst the larger clans, they had no homelands of their own. They were fugitives from feudal decrees imported into the Highlands, whereby the succession of the first male-born took precedence over the old clan system of electing the most able and skilled member of the clan as clan leader. This stand on their principles enabled their enemies to use the decrees of lowland laws to betray, prescribe, attack and dispossess them. When the clan name had been prescribed, MacGregors were forced to shelter under false surnames. The MacGregors might have become an endangered species of Highland life, but their courage ensured their survival. By the decade before Rob Roy's birth, the hunting down of the MacGregors had been halted. The year was 1689. The MacGregors already knew that their Stuart king, James, was no longer King of England. They had learned that in London, the throne had been offered to the Dutchman William of Orange. Deposed by the sharp elbow of political intrigue, James fled to hospitable France. But even more disquieting news now reached the MacGregors. With the English throne now assured, William had secured the crown of Scotland by a narrow vote in the Scottish Parliament. James' reign in Scotland too was now ended. Swiftly, the charismatic James Graham, Viscount Dundee, had raised the flag of restoration for James and the Stuarts on Dundee law. The reluctance of the Protestant Lowland Scots to recruit for the Catholic King James led Dundee to place his faith in the Highland clans, many of whom still clung to the older Catholic faith. Many of them, including the MacGregors, rose for the cause of James, the Jacobite cause. Major General Mackay was sent north with a force of both Scots and English troops to put down Dundee's rebellion. The opposing forces of Dundee and Mackay locked horns by the Tay at Killiecrankie. Dundee's Highlanders, with their terrifying charge, slaughtered some 2,000 of Mackay's men. But with one shot, Mackay snatched political victory for William from the jaws of military defeat. Dundee was downed by a musket ball. He died from a mortal wound. Leaderless, the rebellion froze. From Killiecrankie flowed two effects. The Jacobite cause went underground, and the forces were set in motion for the ultimate destruction and reconstruction of the Highland way of life. In 1693, Rob Roy married Mary of Cromer, Helen Mary MacGregor, from a farm close to Loch Lomond. It was a day of joy and happiness, like all Highland weddings. A day for the exchange of loyalties between bride and groom. Rob and Mary settled initially at Port Nellin, on the northern shore of Loch Katrine. But as his star quickly rose within the clan chief, his cousin Archibald, soon provided him with a land and a house by Loch Lomond, called Craig Roston. Few Lowland Scots had visited Loch Lomond, fewer had heard of it, and even fewer still had a kind word to say about the Highlanders, their family traditions and their homes. For them, the Highlands were another country where the clans operated as small nation-states, defending their lands against each other. Lawless people living in bad lands of brigands, bypassed by progress and civilization, held back by an archaic worship of the past, living in turf-roofed houses that were filled with large families, peat smoke, and animals, whilst they, the lowlanders, were people of quality enjoying the good life that improving trade and commerce harvested. They preferred badinage to barbarism, the coffee house to the croft, the high street to the Highlands. Rob Roy, the MacGregors, and other clans saw things quite differently. Reverence for the family name, the interdependence of the community, honour, courage, valour, and the provision of a fledgling welfare state for clan members in return for rent paid in the Highland currency, cattle. But one man's meat was also another man's envy. Highlanders condemned theft, but at the same time regarded cattle as the property of the entire community, as freely available to all as the Highland air. The delivery of cattle to markets, their protection from the elements and raiders, and their final sale was a major Highland industry. Before his marriage to Mary, Rob Roy had become a cattle drover, charged with such responsibilities. Clans such as the MacGregors operated a security service, protecting cattle routes to markets from cattle robbers called a watch. The watch operated like an almost frictionless machine, lubricated by a special payment given a special name. From the Scots word for rent, mail, came a term that descended into the dictionary in notoriety, blackmail. Rob Roy earned a formidable reputation as a cattle drover. 2 incidents served at his induction into fable and fame. A party of Macraes had trespassed onto Campbell lands by the west of Loch Tay, taking some cattle. Engaged to recover the stolen stock, Rob Roy and his men tracked them across the wastelands of Rannoch Moor and onto the travelling routes of Badenoch, Macpherson territory. Rob Roy located the MacRaes and the cattle, striking at night, recovered and returned the cattle. At Kippen, Rob Roy and his men sought to take the cattle from the wealthy, anti-Jacobite family, the Livingstons. MacGregors were strung out around the village to await the cattle, but this served to raise the resentment of the villagers. When the cattle appeared, the villagers attempted to block the MacGregors' path to them. A light skirmish ensued, after which the villagers were repelled. The drover was slain, and the cattle taken. Rob Roy returned to Kippen to try to reason with its residents. They were not the object of the MacGregors' attack. But when he arrived, there were none to be seen. They had fled, leaving behind a ghost village and their castle. Rob Roy helped himself to such largesse. He was regarded through the Highlands as a man of unflagging energy, with a cold-blooded relentlessness which allowed him to pursue greedy predators, whilst seizing the opportunist moment to show an anti-Jacobite government the vacuum of legitimacy of their laws in his land. His business prospered, taking on more men, safeguarding more important cattle routes to market, droving and retrieving cattle for gentry and landowners. But in 1712 disaster struck. Rob Roy had borrowed £1,000 from James Graham, the Duke of Montrose, to purchase cattle for fattening in the lowlands. He entrusted his experienced drover, MacDonald, with buying the cattle. Sadly, MacDonald did not live up to Rob Roy's trust. He bought the cattle, resold them, then vanished beyond justice. Enraged, Rob Roy sought out MacDonald and the two other important debtors who could pay him the £1,000 he needed to pay back the Duke of Montrose. But Montrose, ever ready to wound a suspected Jacobite, regarded Rob Roy's absence as a flight from debt. The tongues tremored in the coffee houses. Rob Roy was secretly financing a new Jacobite uprising. In reality, he was pursuing 3 debtors, concealed in mists of anonymity. Montrose contacted Rob Roy via his factor, Graham of Killern, offering to forego the £1,000 if Rob Roy would implicate one of Montrose's long-despised political rivals, the Duke of Argyll, as a Jacobite. Rob Roy refused. Montrose retaliated by having Rob Roy declared as an outlaw.
In this warrant, we hereby find in favour of James Graham, the Duke of Montrose, and against Rob Roy MacGregor of Inversneed, a bankrupt in debt to the noble Duke of a considerable sum of money, who refuses all reasonable means to discharge his bankruptcy by discussion or trial. He is to be put to the horn and declared to be out with the law.
Nor did he stop there. Montrose dispatched Graham to evict Rob Roy's wife Mary and the children from their home at Craigroston, seizing his cattle and goods as well. Despite the harshness of the penalty, Rob Roy and his family were soon reunited at the home of a kinsman. They were to be settled in a safe haven in Campbell country, for Rob's mother was a Campbell, and the Campbells felt honoured by his refusal to accuse them of being Jacobites. The clash with Montrose proved a turning point for Rob Roy. He had seen his people suffer at the hands of great families whose jealousies had been forged into hatred. He had seen himself demonised as an outlaw and debtor. He had seen lowland duplicity scoff at Highland diplomacy. He swore revenge on Montrose and the Graham family. Their lands would be raided, their cattle reaved, their grain taken. The fruits of wealth of Montrose would become the grapes of wrath of Rob Roy. On the death of Queen Anne, George, from the German house of Hanover, had become king. A new faction of favourites had been installed at the court, the Duke of Montrose becoming the king's Secretary of State. MacGregor's downfall at his hands, Montrose wondered, would offer the Duke the glittering prospect of accolade, adulation, and advancement. He designed, therefore, to entrap Rob at the annual cattle sale at Crieff. Overnight, the population of Crieff swelled with an influx of troops and spies. Yet somehow, Rob Roy and his men managed to appear at the town cross at night, plenished with whisky, drinking toasts to the Jacobite cause, cheering, singing, dancing to the music of the pipes, and then escaping into the night before the troops could catch them. Their daring impudence was copied successfully by other Jacobite sympathisers in Scottish towns. It became a symbol of discontent with the German King George. Rebellion could not be long in coming. (1715). After 25 years of hibernation, the Jacobite rebellion rose up again. The son of the deposed King James, now dead, also called James, sought his father's throne. Scotland and England had changed since the days of Killiecrankie, two countries but now with one parliament. In 1707, the Scots Parliament in Edinburgh had already voted itself out of existence and merged with the English Parliament in London, amidst accusations that the Scots MPs were the best MPs that money could buy. The Earl of Mar raised the Jacobite standard at Braveheart. But for some of the clans, the Stuarts were a faded glory, long in ambition, short on success. Some distrusted the Earl of Mar, known as Bobbin John, on account of his slippery principles. Amongst the MacGregors, tinges of realism and reluctance were evident. So without committing the clan, Rob Roy joined the Earl of Mar. The rebellion's one major engagement took place at Sheriff Muir, where Mar's forces faced government troops under the Duke of Argyll. The right flank of each army demolished the left flank of the other. The battle was indecisive. The rebellion soon flickered out. If the 1715 rebellion confirmed the Stuarts as the dynasty of broken dreams, for Rob Roy it became a nightmare. Added to his stigma as an outlaw, he was now branded by an Act of Parliament as guilty of high treason. The following Act, passed by Parliament and graciously approved by His Majesty King George, decrees that the following stand accused of high treason against king and country unless they surrender to the King's justice by the last day of June, 1716. Robert Roy MacGregor. Montrose continued his campaigning of attrition, attempting to stain Rob Roy's honour. Rob Roy was offered his lands back if he would point the finger at the Duke of Argyll as a Jacobite. Rob Roy again refused to defame the Highland Code of Honour. Montrose responded as before. Rob Roy's new home in the lands of the Campbells was the target of a raid. It was burned to the ground and all possessions taken. Montrose continued to dangle his land for a lie offer to Rob Roy to incriminate Argyll. But in a move to outflank him, Rob Roy surrendered to the sympathetic Argyll. Rob Roy and his men gave themselves up to the Duke of Argyll, proudly surrendering their worst weapons. Their best weapons they kept for the raid on Montrose's lands. Rob was a consummate player in the game of Machiavellian intrigue which allowed a supposed outlaw and traitor to the crown to continue to use the skills of skullduggery against his personal enemy, Montrose. Montrose was allowed one moment of triumph against him. After a chase through the glens to Balquhidder, Rob Roy sought refuge in his new home there. As he lay asleep, his home was surrounded by Montrose's men. Arrested, he was bound to be taken to Stirling. But by the fords of Frew, Montrose's elation evaporated. Using a hidden knife, Rob Roy cut himself free from his captor and dashed into the cold water. Montrose's dream was dashed by the fords of Frew. Rob Roy could not be defeated. Word of his exploits flashed from clan member to clan member, of how Rob Roy had raided Inversnaid barracks which the government were constructing to keep him in check, and of how he halted its construction by capturing all the workmen. And of his novel fact-finding methods, whereby people reluctant to speak were gently lowered into the waters of Loch Lomond and asked the same questions again. Rob Roy's submit or submerge policy was extremely successful. Of evicting 2 soldiers from his very own cave, where they were sheltering whilst on a foray to capture him. Of how he would secure rent from Montrose's tenants, and then provide them with a receipt saying that they had in fact paid the rent due to Montrose. Would Montrose's acceptance of defeat mean victory for Rob Roy? No. The poisoned chalice of vanquishing the MacGregor was passed to the Duke of Athol, a man most enthusiastic to promote his credentials as a loyal supporter of King George. He tried a more direct route than Montrose, blatant betrayal. Rob Roy was invited to a meeting with Athol to discuss the politics of the day. Rob Roy's faith in a man's honour overrode his understandable suspicions. Why, the Duke had provided him with his personal guarantee of safe conduct to attend. The meeting on the politics of the day had just one item on the agenda. Would Rob Roy declare that the Duke of Argyll was a Jacobite sympathiser? Rob Roy had heard it all before. The same old story from an embittered Duke. When he refused, he was surrounded and arrested. He was imprisoned near Dunkeld, but Athol was denied his treacherous triumph. Security at the prison was not all that good. Rob managed to enrapture his captors with a portion of Highland charm and celebrity, enlivened by more than a dash of whisky, a present from visitors anxious as to his welfare. A duped head jailer allowed Rob to write a note to his wife to be presented to her by a servant who appeared outside the jail with a horse. Quick as a flash, he was off. (1719), and yet another failed attempt to restore the Stuart monarchy in Britain. A latter-day Spanish armada was to set sail from Spain and land an invasion force in the south of England, while clan chiefs, exiled in 1715, were to land in Scotland to provoke a rising in the north. They landed in Scotland, along with Spanish mercenaries, based themselves by Loch Alsh, and waited for word to advance. What came instead was yet one more of those disasters that seemed to perpetually haunt the Jacobite cause. The news that the invasion fleet had been wrecked off Cape Finisterre. The smell of defeat was already in the air. Unaware, Rob Roy raised 20 MacGregors for the rising. When the Scottish Jacobites realised they were isolated and beaten, their commander, evicted from his base on Loch Alsh by a naval raid, surprisingly decided to fight on rather than disperse his men. At Glenshiel, clans loyal to King George faced clans loyal to the Jacobites, including Rob Roy. Clan clashed with clan as the king's men pummeled the Jacobites. Forced to retreat, Rob Roy and the Jacobites knew that they were beaten. The dream had vanished to await a new generation. Rob Roy vanished too, into the shelter of Glen Shira. It was to be his last call to arms for a Jacobite insurgency. The following year, convinced that he was safe from government troops, he returned to the security of wife, family, and Balquhidder. For the rest of his life, Rob Roy lived at Balquhidder in relative peacefulness, secure in his reputation as the best drover in the land. But the beginning of the end came when a minor dispute arose between the MacGregors and the MacLarens over ownership of a piece of land in 1734. To settle the dispute, a duel took place between Rob Roy and the young champion of the MacLarens. They fought with broadsword. And the young man succeeded in cutting Rob Roy and drawing his blood, the first man ever to do so in a battle or in duel. Rob Roy conceded victory to the young man, graciously complimenting him on his dexterity. It was the young displacing the old, the admission that, at last, 40 years of rebellion had worn out the hand and the eye of the swordsmith. As the months came and went, his health deteriorated. In December 1734, he was visited by the head of the MacLarens as a peace offering. In very poor health, Rob Roy insisted on receiving MacLaren in his chair. The meeting over, Rob Roy retired to bed, exhausted. "It's over," he told his wife. "Call the piper. Let him play. I shall return no more." The piper was summoned, and as he played, Rob Roy breathed his last. His death ushered in the birth of his legend.